So, Charles Spencer just casually drops a bombshell that rewrites 3 decades of royal family history. And the way he did it is honestly more interesting than the letter itself. Like, the man put on white cotton archivist gloves, pulled out an antique mahogany box from a vault under his mansion, and unlocked it with an ornate iron key while the morning sun streamed through the library windows. That's not a press release, that's theatre. And the timing. 3 weeks before Princess Diana died in Paris, she sat down at her desk in Kensington Palace and wrote a letter to Princess Anne that nobody knew existed until now. The public has been told for 30 years that these two women were basically rivals who couldn't stand each other. The media painted Diana as the emotional fashion icon and Anne as the no-nonsense workhorse who supposedly rolled her eyes at all the drama. Turns out that was completely wrong. And what's wild is that the palace probably knew it the whole time. Before we get into this, if you're new here on Crown Watch, hit subscribe real quick so you don't miss updates when stories like this break. Okay, so let's talk about what's actually in this letter because the details are way more specific than vague emotional complaints. Diana wasn't just venting about feeling isolated. She had gotten her hands on an internal palace document 2 days before writing this letter, and that document outlined a plan to reduce her security detail as a way to pressure her into giving up her independent media work. She called it an administrative trap. That's her phrase, not Charles Spencer's, not some biographer's interpretation. She wrote that the ultimate goal was to use an ancient clause in the 1772 Royal Marriages Act to launch a custody dispute over William and Harry, asserting that the sovereign had the right to control where they lived, where they went to school, and basically every aspect of their daily lives. That's not a woman being paranoid. That's a woman who saw the legal machinery being assembled against her and decided to document it. When you actually look at what was said versus what happened in the years after her death, the letter becomes even more significant. Diana specifically asked Anne to be an emotional barrier between her sons and the traditionalists, who wanted to shape them into distant symbols of the state. She wrote that Anne was the only member of the Windsor family with the courage to look a reigning monarch in the eye and defend a mother's basic human rights. And here's what nobody's really talking about yet. Anne actually did it for 30 years. She did exactly what Diana asked, and she never said a word about it publicly. The court circular logs show that between 1997 and 2005, Anne quietly adjusted her charity schedules so she'd be at Windsor during the boys' school breaks. No cameras, no press, no royal correspondence documenting her visits. She'd just show up in her private car, walk with William and Harry through the park, and give them space away from the public relations chaos happening at Clarence House. That's not a coincidence. That's a woman executing a promise she made to her sister-in-law. The thing that makes this whole situation feel different from typical royal gossip is the physical evidence. Charles Spencer didn't just make an announcement. He spent 48 hours working with a forensic document examiner from the London Probate Archives before saying anything publicly. They compared the handwriting pressure points against hundreds of verified letters in the Spencer family repository. The signature was authenticated. The paper had the Kensington Palace crest embossed at the top. The date in the corner reads August 10th, 1997. That's exactly 21 days before the crash in Paris. And there's a second copy of this letter sitting in a law firm vault on Fleet Street, sealed in a lead-lined container that was registered under an anonymous corporate holding company 30 years ago. The palace legal team apparently tried to find grounds to block publication, but they couldn't. The letter was addressed to a private individual, not a state official, and it was found in the private archives of Althorp House. The Crown has zero constitutional authority over it. So that's where it gets weird. Because if the palace knew this letter existed, or at least suspected it might exist, then the entire public narrative about Diana and Anne's relationship was knowingly false. The media spent years describing an intense, freezing rivalry between them, claiming Anne viewed Diana as a shallow celebrity who was damaging the monarchy. But the administrative records tell a completely different story. Between 1996 and 1997, Anne's charitable schedules placed her in the same regional sectors as Diana's private humanitarian visits on multiple occasions. Their cars were logged at identical service depots near the M4 motorway within 30 minutes of each other on 3 separate dates. Those weren't traffic coincidences. Those were private briefings where Anne was giving Diana tactical updates on the legal strategies being developed by the King's solicitors. And that timeline doesn't add up with another detail that's now coming out. In the summer of 1996, during a private family dinner at Balmoral Castle, a senior advisor to the Queen, suggested using ancient Crown property statutes to restrict Diana's access to her apartments at Kensington Palace. The idea was to force her to move her office outside London, which would have reduced her ability to capture media attention. Princess Anne interrupted the presentation and shut it down completely, calling it an act of absolute corporate stupidity that would permanently damage the Crown's public standing. The eviction proposal was killed before it could even be drafted into an official warrant. Diana found out about the confrontation the next morning through a secure telephone link provided by Anne's lady-in-waiting. So these two women weren't just cordial, they were actively coordinating against the palace machinery. Honestly, the fact that Anne kept this secret for 3 decades is the most revealing part of the whole story. Think about how many people have sold Diana's stories over the years. Former staff members wrote tell-all books. Friends gave interviews to documentary crews. Secret tape recordings were sold to international broadcasters for millions of pounds. Through every single wave of public obsession, Anne gave 0 interviews. She authorised 0 press statements. She kept her copy of the letter locked in a fireproof military-grade combination safe at Gatcombe Park, hidden beneath equestrian breeding logs and family land titles. When the palace archivists requested a comprehensive audit of her private correspondence files ahead of the King's Jubilee events, she rejected the request instantly. She told them her safe contained personal family correspondence entirely separate from the state's administrative workflow, and she refused to hand over the keys. The palace legal department apparently realised they had no grounds to force a daughter of Queen Elizabeth to surrender her private papers without creating a damaging internal court battle. So the letter stayed locked away until Charles Spencer travelled to Gloucester by private car to brief Anne on what he'd found at Althorp. He told her his legal team had verified the original manuscript and that he believed the public interest required publication to correct the false historical narrative. Anne listened in complete silence, leaning on her roll-top desk, and then gave her quiet endorsement. She recognised that, with the Althorp copy fully authenticated, any attempt to hide the duplicate would look like a desperate palace cover-up. The safe was opened later that afternoon so her solicitors could cross-reference the text one final time. The duplicate copy matched exactly. The same pressure points in the handwriting, the same faded black rollerball ink, and the same Kensington Palace paper. The content of the letter itself contains details that are going to cause serious problems for the current palace administration. Diana referenced a secret personal repository containing over 200 original letters and diary entries from her school days and early marriage. She wrote that she had hidden this repository entirely outside the palace infrastructure, completely separate from the royal archives at Windsor Castle. And here's the part that's probably keeping palace lawyers awake tonight. She instructed her personal trustees to release the entire archive to the public if the central administration ever attempted to completely block her access to her sons following the upcoming autumn term. That means there might be 200 more documents sitting in an anonymous vault somewhere, and their release is tied to a condition that Diana set in writing. The King's advisors are reportedly working to track the movement of old Spencer family holdings from that era, trying to locate the repository before any further disclosures happen. When you think about the broader pattern here, it exposes something fundamental about how the palace operates. For decades, the public relations machinery worked systematically to frame the royal friction of the 1990s as a simple, tragic breakdown of a private marriage. Millions of pounds from the sovereign grant went into projecting an image of modern, streamlined continuity. The goal was to make the current reign look stable and unified. But the revelation of a hidden alliance between Diana and Anne completely dismantles that corporate narrative. It proves that the deepest trust within the court belonged to the traditional guard rather than the central hierarchy. Anne, whom the media portrayed as cold and distant, was actually the one Diana trusted most. The old administrative guard, who supposedly represented stability and order, was actively working to isolate and pressure the mother of the future king. The palace communications department apparently went into complete chaos on Thursday morning when the news broke. Over 300 administrative computers within the palace network simultaneously accessed the high-resolution scans uploaded from the Althorp Palace press server. Senior media directors abandoned their morning tea to crowd around the monitoring wall, watching BBC News and Sky News broadcast continuous live coverage. The front pages featured large black typography analysing the phrase administrative trap that Diana had written 33 years earlier. The King's advisors started calculating the strategic damage immediately. Public opinion polls showed over 80% of citizens praising Anne for carrying the emotional burden in silence. While perception of the old administrative guard plummeted, the text explicitly portrayed the palace bureaucracy as a cold, controlling machine that prioritized institutional control over basic human compassion. The timing created an immediate operational problem for the communications team. They had been scheduled to launch a major media campaign on Friday morning to promote Queen Camilla's upcoming state charity appearances in London. After the letter went viral, the media directors realised that proceeding with fashion and lifestyle updates would look incredibly tone-deaf. While the public was reading about a mother's final desperate warning, the King's chief secretary froze the entire promotional schedule and locked the media assets back in the archive safe. Then came the phone call between Clarence House and Adelaide Cottage that really shows where the power dynamic has shifted. The King's advisors wanted Prince William to sign a joint family statement that would acknowledge the letter's historical value, while framing it as a reflection of a bygone era of court tension. William rejected the script completely during a 20-minute call. He told his father's private secretary that he wouldn't authorise his staff to participate in any campaign designed to minimise or spin his mother's original words. He said the letter was an authentic piece of his family history, and he fully respected the absolute non-disclosure that his Aunt Anne had maintained for 30 years to protect his childhood. By refusing to back the defensive strategy, William effectively isolated the King's advisors and left the central palace apparatus exposed to the full force of public scrutiny. The press office phones rang continuously, with hundreds of international journalists demanding to know if the Crown would launch a formal investigation into the secret repository mentioned in the text. The press secretaries had no answers. They could only read a repetitive, generic statement about the private nature of historical family papers, their voices reportedly cracking under the pressure. The image of the palace that emerges from all this is not one of dignified continuity. It's an image of a bureaucracy that spent decades managing a false narrative, only to have it shattered by a single sheet of light blue paper that was locked in a mahogany box beneath a country estate. Diana's postscript at the bottom of the letter adds a haunting final layer. She wrote that she was leaving for the Mediterranean the following morning with a deep sense of administrative anxiety, feeling that her time to secure her son's emotional safety was rapidly running out. That line, written 3 weeks before her death, transforms the document from a piece of family correspondence into something much heavier. It's a time-stamped record of a mother who knew the institutional forces arrayed against her and chose to document them in writing, trusting that the document would eventually surface. And it did surface, not through a leak or a tabloid payoff, but through her brother putting on white gloves in a library and unlocking a box with a key that had been waiting for this moment. The administrative verification was officially stamped into the database at the London High Court Probate Registry on Friday afternoon. The original manuscript was placed in a temperature-controlled archival box and permanently registered in the National History Logs. That legal act means Diana's words are now part of the public record, beyond the reach of palace censorship or modification. The public reaction outside Buckingham Palace was striking. Thousands of people stood in silence, holding evening editions of newspapers that featured full-page replicas of her sloping handwriting. Polls showed over 90% of respondents expressing gratitude for Anne's protection of the young princes. The country didn't react with political anger, so much as with a shared moment of reflection, as if everyone was collectively recalibrating their understanding of what actually happened behind those palace walls. What emerges from the letter and the 30 years of silence that followed is a story about two women whom the world assumed were enemies, but who were actually operating as allies against a system that wanted to control them both. Diana needed someone inside the institution who couldn't be bullied or sidelined. Anne was that person. She had spent her entire career fighting against traditional expectations, refusing to let the press dictate her public profile, rejecting image consultants, and running her office with fierce independence that frequently annoyed the central hierarchy. When Diana's marriage dissolved and her aristocratic friends withdrew their invitations to avoid offending the future king, Anne was the only senior Windsor who refused to participate in the isolation campaign. She didn't make speeches about it. She didn't leak to the press. She just kept showing up, kept providing information, and kept her promise for 3 decades. The modern court now faces a reality where its long-term narrative management has been neutralised by a document it couldn't control and couldn't suppress. Prince William emerges from the fallout with his position strengthened, because the public now recognises that his approach to leadership is directly aligned with the emotional blueprint his mother fought to protect. The old guard of advisors has retreated into silence, confronted with the uncomfortable truth that, within the history of the Crown, An authentic maternal voice carries more lasting power than the cold mechanics of institutional control. A mahogany box in a Northamptonshire library just did what 30 years of palace public relations couldn't do. It told the truth. And the truth is that when the system turned against Princess Diana, her most trusted protector was the hardest working royal of them all. And that's the detail that keeps coming back to me as I sit with this story. Anne never broke her word. In an institution where loyalty is constantly tested against political convenience, where alliances shift with every change in public sentiment, Anne remained absolutely steadfast. She didn't do it for recognition. She didn't do it for legacy. She did it because a mother asked her to protect her children, and she understood the weight of that request in a way that the palace machinery simply couldn't comprehend. The letter reveals that Diana knew exactly what she was doing when she chose Anne. She wrote that Anne possessed a quality increasingly rare within the family, which she described as moral courage, unconnected to public approval or writings. That phrase alone reframes everything we thought we knew about the internal dynamics of the Windsor family during its most turbulent modern period. There's something deeply moving about the physical details of how Anne preserved the secret. The fireproof safe at Gatcombe Park wasn't some sterile institutional storage unit. It was tucked behind her personal study, surrounded by the ordinary clutter of her rural life. Equestrian ribbons hung on the wall nearby. Weather reports for upcoming horse trials were pinned to a corkboard. The letter sat beneath decades of breeding logs, as if she had deliberately buried it within the most mundane aspects of her daily existence, knowing that nobody would think to look there for a document of such explosive historical significance. When the safe was finally opened for the cross-referencing, Anne's solicitors noted that the envelope containing the letter was still sealed with the original wax stamp Diana had used. Anne had never even reopened it after the initial reading. She had read it once, understood the mission, and locked it away, carrying the weight of its contents in her memory alone for 3 decades.